Hey everybody, Dr. Hassan, how's it going? So, this unit was brought on by the leaking of a draft decision by a Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito, within which he indicated that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned 5-4 sometime in the near future. And so that's what brought this on. And I think it's a useful thing to talk about, not only because of its recency, but also because it addresses these issues in a way that I want you to think about them. Which is, I want you to be thinking about the relationship between the moral questions that we're, of course, thinking about in this class. For example, is abortion moral or immoral on some particular occasion or not? And more political questions related to how a society as a whole should be structured. So that's one of the nice things about talking about this issue, is it brings that into greater relief. Now, another thing, just by way of setup, because of how I do these videos, it's sort of odd to do a video where I want the class to be about you developing your own point of view, because the best way to have you develop your own point of view is in a discussion, and this is not that. And the way that I do my classes, generally speaking, is I approach them in a kind of discussion-based way. And I can't do that here. So one of the things that I thought of doing, and can do on some occasions, is sort of give you both sides of an issue and present it in a neutral way, where I present one side, present its arguments, and then I present another opposing side and present its arguments. Depending on what we talk about, I will do that. But I can't really do that across the board in this unit. Okay? Not because the issues I'm talking about are not controversial, because they are, but it's just that a lot of the controversy involves, as you'll see, arguments where on one side, it's just one side has a sort of basic handle on reality, and the other one, even though it's controversial, does not have a basic handle on reality. And so I can't really present you with a sort of neutral perspective where I pretend like there's legitimate arguments on both sides, when you look at an opposing side and you examine their arguments, they're just nutty. Okay, so I'm not going to do that here. Okay. Always, anyway. I will say that as far as like the issue of abortion, and like whether or not a particular act of abortion is or is not right or wrong on some particular occasion, that is controversial, and there are good arguments on both sides. Just for the sake of discussion, I think the moderate position, which says that abortion sometimes is okay and sometimes is not okay, it's probably the correct one. That shouldn't surprise you, right? So extreme pro-life positions, as they're oftentimes put, or extreme pro-choice positions, those are both difficult to defend. So I do think the issue of whether or not to have an abortion on a particular occasion is controversial. But I don't think the sort of framing of the issue that I'm going to give here in terms of the rights of women and how women have been oppressed throughout society, I don't think that's controversial. So I'm not going to pretend like it is. Okay. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to present a sort of one-sided view of things because I don't think the other side has much of a leg to stand on. You might disagree. That's fine. And I guess part of the problem is we can't have a discussion on that point. But the other thing to say is I do think that the article that I had you read, I do think that's controversial. You can agree, for example, that women's rights is an issue, and disagree about how to frame the response to it. All right, so let's dive in with this sort of discussion of the relationship between the morality of abortion and the sort of broader political issue. So the first thing to just sort of get at with what I'm talking about here, when I say that, there's a relationship between politics and morality, is you have to understand that there's nothing inconsistent at all about saying that someone has a legal, or if you like, a political right to do something immoral. I mean, all sorts of examples come to mind. You might think that adultery is immoral, for example. I'm assuming you do, right? But it's at least a separate question whether or not you should think that adultery is illegal, right? Now, sometimes when I say this, people are like, yeah, it should be, off with their heads. Okay, fine, that can be your view, but it's at least a discussion that we need to have. Even just because it's immoral does not make it so that it's obviously illegal, right? And so the question of the legality of abortion is way more complicated than the question of whether or not it's moral or immoral on particular occasions. So again, I'm going to operate, given the sort of framing of this issue, I'm going to operate under the assumption that it's sometimes moral and sometimes not. But that is not obvious. I mean, I'm open to having, I'm open to the idea that there are potential arguments for a strong pro-life position or potential arguments for a strong pro-choice position. Okay, I do think that's controversial. I do think whether or not abortion as a moral act is or is not wrong is controversial. But for the purposes of this unit, because of how I want to frame it within the context of this recent imminent overturning of Roe, I am going to set that aside. So let me put it this way. Suppose you did think that abortion was almost always immoral. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that you did think that. Then one of the things you might do is say, precisely for that reason, it should be legal. Okay? Why? It's not that hard to understand. When you legalize something, you regulate it. You bring education about it, right? You normalize it, right? Which makes it less rebellious, for example. Okay? And a lot of times, incidences of the thing you don't like go down. Okay? So I'm not saying that's true, but it's within the realm of possibility that the best thing for a pro-life position would be to legalize abortion, because it could, through regulation, education, normalization, actually bring the amounts of abortions down. On the flip side of it, we know that making abortion illegal does nothing to decrease it. That people still seek abortions in unsafe ways on the black market, and so on and so forth. So maybe it's a little too strong to say it does nothing, but it's naive to think that, we'll say a little bit more about this, that by overturning Roe and there's going to be a federal ban on the horizon after that, assuming things go a certain way politically, it's naive to think that that would decrease the incidence of abortion. That's not how it necessarily happens. A good example is in Ecuador. For example, it's illegal, but it happens all the time because there's like the equivalent of the morning after pill or the early term version of that that's available on the black market. So abortions still happen illegally there. Anyway, okay. So right. So just keep in mind that the legal question and the moral question are very different. I mean, another example of it is marijuana use. You might think that marijuana use is highly immoral, right? Well, then you would be, advised to know that in places where it's legalized, incidences of it among youth, for example, go way down. I mean, this has been shown in like Colorado, for example. After marijuana use was legalized, youth use of a marijuana decreased. And that just goes to show that the issues are more complicated, right? So someone who thinks a woman should have a right to choose can think that, and also think that that includes the right to do something wrong, because they can say it's a legal right. There's nothing inconsistent about that. The legal question and the moral question are different. I hope that that's clear. All right. So what I wanted to do is just sort of set the context for the potential imminent overturning of Roe by giving you some historical context for Roe itself. Okay, so abortion was made legal within, it's called the women's liberation movement. And it's difficult to, or it's controversial to say when it exactly began, but most people think of it as starting or gaining steam around the 1960s within the context of the broader civil rights movement. But I mean, if you wanted to think about it, you could start in the late 19th century, I should say, up until 1920 when women were given the right to vote, right? But the abortion, when it was made legal by Roe v. Wade in 1973, right? That was within the context of this movement. And prior to that, like in the 50s and the 60s, and certainly before 1920, women were oppressed in a variety of ways. For example, a woman was not allowed to have a credit card of her own if she was married. She had to have the credit card put in her husband's name all the way up until 1975. So in 1974, if you were a woman and you were married, you couldn't have your own credit. And single women found it difficult to get credit up until that point. The contraception, right, the pill, right, birth control, it only became available in 1960. And prior to that, women had no ability to, no effective form of birth control that was legalized anyway. So that was as late as 1960. Up until 1968, you could still live in certain areas of the country where a woman couldn't serve on a jury. So in 1968, it was Alabama, I believe, or maybe it was Mississippi. You can look that up. Where that was when a woman being allowed to serve on a jury was allowed. Okay. The whole idea of shelters for women who were victims of domestic abuse, those came about in the 1960s. So there was sort of a normalization, a hush-hush about domestic abuse. Sherwin talks about this, right? The idea of marital rape being allowed, and so on and so forth. So all of that, right, was part of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, which was part of the broader civil rights movement. And so you cannot understand the granting of the political right to have an abortion absent that political context. So again, I'm talking about the legal question here, separating it from the moral question of whether an abortion is right or wrong on any particular occasion. The right for a woman to have an abortion was granted within the broader context of the women's liberation movement. And so now you can see how that gives context to the current moves of this Supreme Court, because what you're seeing is a kind of conservative backlash, a reactionary backlash to these sorts of progressive movements like the civil rights movement. I mean, that happened ever since the 1980s with respect to the civil rights movement of the 60s, and we're sort of still living through the effects of that in the so-called neoliberal era, which is the era that we're living in under modern capitalism. You can see it as a reaction, broadly speaking, to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And right now, you are in the context of a conservative backlash to a lot of pushes for equality with respect to women's liberation movement. Think of gay rights, think of trans rights, and how those are being overturned, those are being violated. Okay, but most recently, there have been very extreme, and I want to emphasize extreme legal attacks on abortion in some southern states. And so the overturning of Roe, the imminent overturning of it, cannot be divorced from that context. For example, in Texas right now, anyone can sue any provider that they suspect of aiding in an abortion. And that means anybody can sue anybody in that respect. So, for example, if you are a staunch pro-life person and you suspect that your neighbor down the street got an abortion from some doctor, then you can sue the doctor. I mean, it's unclear how broadly this law should be interpreted. It's sort of a wacky law in that respect, because maybe you can, in that same imagined context, sue the cousin of the woman who got the abortion for driving the woman to the clinic, for example. And so the idea, of course, is to discourage people from having abortions by subjecting them, especially providers, to lawsuits where they lose money and they go out of business as a result. That's perfectly legal right now in Texas. In Oklahoma just got a law on the books very, very recently that outlawed abortion from fertilization. Now, that's sort of interesting because they did keep perfectly legal things like the morning after pill and birth control, but they defined, despite that, they defined life as beginning not with conception, where the fertilized egg is implanted in the uterus, but with fertilization, okay, which is a few days before or a week before. Now, okay, so that's in Oklahoma, right? And so that's one of the strictest bans possible. I mean, Louisiana this didn't happen. It was thankfully reversed, but Louisiana almost made abortion murder, where they could prosecute the woman who got an abortion for murder. Political backlash prevented that from happening, but it was very close. So this is all happening right now. And if you want to know which way the political winds are blowing, a federal ban is coming. I mean, it depends on how things politically shake out. But if we get a Republican-dominated Senate, a Republican-dominated House, and a Republican president in 2024, you can rest assured that a federal ban will occur. Okay, and from there you can see, and they've talked about it. The rhetoric is such that they've talked about outlawing things like the morning after pill, things like birth control, and so on and so forth. A lot of the rhetoric of people who are leading, in Republican states is suggesting that they are wanting to take this even further. And it's because of the sort of evangelical Christian right dominating conservative politics and framing this pro-life issue. Okay, so all of that and all the rollback of women's rights is on the horizon with this decision. That should not be ignored or should not be something you don't take seriously. It's very, very serious what's going on. And when it actually does happen, when Roe is overturned, you're not going to be surprised to learn that it's going to affect poor people. And it's going to have all sorts of problematic societal consequences that people have not really fully come to grips with yet, but they definitely are coming. For half of the women who get abortions make $18,000 or less, or maybe I think it's less than $18,000 a year. So over half of the abortions that take place are from low-income folks. And that, as you know, is disproportionately, therefore, people of color. So this is going to affect people of color and poor people way more than it's going to affect wealthy people. And that's how it's always been, just to be clear, right? I mean, when a woman wanted to get an abortion and she was wealthy, she could always just fly overseas, for example, and get it in some European country. Okay? Or you can travel to a state like Massachusetts prior to this, if the federal ban doesn't come, right? And you have the money to travel and take off work. Okay? But poor folks don't necessarily have that ability. And so this law will disproportionately affect them, for sure. Okay, so I want that, all of that stuff to be sort of what contextualizes the decision. It is a rolling back of the women's rights And it's a rolling back of the rights granted to women as part of the women's liberation movement, right? The pay gap, for example, is still disgustingly wide, right? Something like 80 cents on the dollar, much less if you're a woman of color. This will definitely affect the pay gap. The pay gap will increase as a result of this for obvious reasons. Okay. So what is and this sort of sets up Sherwin's article, right? What is the relationship between abortion rights and these broader issues about women's rights? Well, it all relates to patriarchy, right? Western society, and certainly American society, has been patriarchal since its foundation, favoring the rights of wealthy white males. I mean, it's written in the Constitution. It's, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you look at who they got that from, which is John Locke in his second treatise of government, he said life, liberty, and property. So they didn't want to put that in the Thomas Jefferson was a smart propagandist. He didn't want to put it in the Declaration of Independence, so he said pursuit of happiness. But if you look at the way that the government was structured, it was obviously designed to favor propertied white males. They were the only ones that were allowed to vote. The Senate was where all the power was originally in the Constitution, and the Senate was all wealthy white males, and the Senate was not democratically elected. It was the state legislatures who originally elected senators. So we were never meant to be a democracy at the start. If you think we were, you just are wrong. The idea is we were meant to be a kind of, one way of putting it is oligarchy, right? Because these state legislatures, they chose all the senates, and of course the state legislatures were the wealthy white males picking the other wealthy white males, making sure, right, that no one took their wealth. I mean, that's just sort of obvious that if you were wealthy, you'd want to frame the laws so that nobody can take your wealth. So as a result of that, I don't need to remind you of all the way that oppression took place. I mean, we can think about the way that, you're sitting on stolen land right now. You're standing on stolen land from indigenous peoples, slavery, right? Our country is founded on this form of oppression. It's founded on that kind of genocide, and the sort of economic development took place on the backs of slaves and indentured servants. Something like in the middle of the 19th century, something like half the population was either a slave or an indentured servant in this country. And the sort of the Industrial Revolution took place within that context. Okay, so you can see any sort of restriction of abortion, if you just want to sort of treat it in a vacuum naively, you can, but that is problematic. That is naive. Any of it should be seen within the context of that pattern of oppression of women and minorities throughout our history. Okay, and this is where, Sherwin's stuff I do think is helpful, because you can see this and it shows up in sort of implicit, you have to look for it ways, but look at how the way that the issue is framed. Oftentimes, the discourse with respect to abortion. It's the discourse relating to the so-called rights of a fetus, right? And the idea is that abortion is murder and that the fetus is a person, right? Well, so the sort of way to think about that within the context of what I'm talking about is the whole idea that a person has rights was something that the patriarchy used as a way to justify its form of oppression. Think of property rights as one obvious example. Property rights are crucial to our society's functioning. They are, central to the way that the government has been framed and the courts operate, okay, and so on and so forth. And of course, property rights are designed to be individual rights. If I, the person, work for something, then I, the person, have a right to it, and you have no right to take it away from me. So that's all should be contextualized by the patriarchy. Because if you're a wealthy white male, one of the ways you want to keep your wealth is by coming up with a philosophical system that allows you to do that. And thinking about property rights as rights of a person is one way to do that. And so the individual rights of a fetus, right, you can see them as adjacent to that same sort of thing. When you talk about individual rights of a person and you make it about property rights, you're going to, by extension, be able to talk about the individual rights of a fetus. But of course, right, why is it indicative of patriarchy as well? Because they don't actually mean it, right? Anybody who says abortion, anybody who calls themselves pro-life, right, and we're talking about people who support the life of a fetus, right, then if they actually meant it, right, then they would have all sorts of policies in place that would support the life of the born child. It's not like an unborn child has rights, but as soon as they're born, they got to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and fend for themselves. I mean, that's absurd, right? So the idea that it's indicative of a patriarchal society is how talk of that individual rights is fundamentally hypocritical, because if you were actually pro-life, right, then you would give that fetus an individual rights and also care about them after they were born. So anybody who has a policy that's that's anti-abortion, but doesn't do anything to help the born child, the infant, is a hypocrite, right? And the idea would be that's exactly what you would expect from a patriarchal framing of things. Hope that that's clear. So, it's a useful thing because, I want you to sort of get this skill, develop this skill, because it shows up, like it almost sounds like conspiratorial. I hope it doesn't. I hope it strikes you as beyond obvious, because it's all over the place. It's very salient. But the reason why I'm saying it now is it shows up in kind of subtle ways, including like the discourse, right? So you might not have thought that in talk of the individual rights of the fetus is indicative of patriarchy, but it is in a kind of implicit way, because you can see how if you are a patriarchal society, you would want to frame the issue where individual rights are important. Why? Because that allows you to talk about your individual rights, including your property rights, which allow you to keep the patriarchy in place. So, Sherwin has some interesting arguments, right? For her policies, she approaches it from a policy issues. And I thought a lot of it was insightful, but I do also want to say that some of it is controversial. And so I hope this comes up in the discussion, and I'll try to, ask at least one discussion forum question that gets at that. Okay, that allows you to sort of address the controversial aspects of her view. So if you read in that article, she says, well, okay, the reason why women do or do not have an abortion, it's extremely complex, and it's not just about morality. I mean, why don't we get real about, how life actually works? If you are somebody and you're wondering what you should do, should I have an abortion? Should I carry a child to term? Morality is one normative consideration. We talked about that in the introductory concepts video, or I should say the much younger version of me talked about that, right? The idea is, normative ethical questions are one kind of norm, and they do, I hope, to the extent that you are not a sociopath, I hope that morality matters to you, but none of us is like, what should I do? I'm at a crossroads. Oh, that's the right thing to do. Oh, I guess I'll do that. Like, that's not how life works. Life is more complicated than that, in the sense that there are other normative considerations. We talked about some, right? Legal norms are an example, right? They can come apart from moral norms. The legal should is different from the moral should, if you recall, right? So, now approach a situation, an actual situation, where you're wondering whether or not you should have an abortion. Well, you might think it's moral, or you might think it's immoral to have one, but you might also have to think about what the laws are in your state. All right? And that's going to determine whether or not you think you should have one. You might think about self-interested norms. What's good for you? Is it the right kind of thing? I can tell you from experience that It's a big sacrifice being a parent, all right? I mean, I love it. I don't think the sacrifice is the right word, but it's a big job. It's a big obligation as my kid sleeps up there right now, and I wait for him to wake up. It's a big, obligation. And so it's from a self-interested standpoint, it's complicated, right? Think about your duties to your friends. Think about your duties to your coworkers, right? And so you can imagine a situation where you have to sort of figure out what you should do, all things considered, where the moral consideration about whether it's right or wrong is just one normative thing pulling on you among many other legal norms, social norms, self-interested norms, norms related to your coworkers, professional norms, and so on and so forth, right? And so the idea that we should have some sort of broad one-size-fits-all policy where you just say it's always wrong, never do it, is misguided, right? And then who better to know how to make that decision, to weigh all the pros and cons? Well, there's the moral consideration, there's the legal consideration, there's the self-interested consideration. Who better to make that decision than the pregnant women themselves? It's obvious, right? Only they're going to be in the best position to know what to do, right? And so that the idea is that's why it should be left up to the woman. It's because life is complicated. Morality is part of life, but it's not the only part of life. And so everybody has to know how to act given all the complexities of life. And in the case of an abortion, it's probably more complex than usual because you have to think about the life of this child. Well, who better to know how to navigate that? Okay, you get the point. And so the idea, right, is that society that we actually have, it doesn't actually do anything to make it any easier. So in other words, I'm just sort of reiterating what I said before, but here it comes up yet again. Anybody who's actually pro-life, if you were actually pro-life, then you would, if you wanted to outlaw abortion, you would, for example, want to beef up adoption services. You would want to increase the social safety net to decrease poverty. We have the largest, not one of, it's depressing. We have the largest rate of childhood poverty among developed nations. So we would do things like that, right? And increase funding for education so that this child has a good education. You would make sure that they have enough to eat, and so on and so forth, right? And so anybody who wants to say, well, it should be illegal and we're not going to do anything else, right, is a hypocrite. That's the idea. If you're actually pro-life, then have a set of policies that makes it so that you actually care about the child and shows that. Okay. All right, that's all. Take care.